Hello and welcome to this CodeRage session titled Choosing a Data Access Component Layer in RAD Studio XE7. My name is Lachlan Gemmell. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I'm a co-director of the Continuity Group Proprietary Limited. I'm the current president of the Australian Delphi User Group. I run the T-Index website, www.tindex.net, which is a Delphi directory website. I'm an Embarcadero MVP, and there's my email address if you'd like to reach me about anything. Out of the box, you've got a staggering 6 different options for accessing databases. Now, some of these you should just steer well away from. Others, the choice between them is more difficult. We have, roughly in chronological order, the Ball Database Engine, or BDE. That's your traditional T-database, T-table, and T-query components. dbGo, formerly dbExpress, which is the ADO component supplied with Delphi Professional. That includes the T-ADO connection, T-ADO dataset, T-ADO table, and T-ADO query. dbExpress, or IPX, which, as its name suggests, is useful only for accessing interbase databases, but also Firebird. Then we have dbExpress, which consists of the TSQL connection and TSQL dataset, plus a few others components. DataSnap, once known as Midas. Now, DataSnap is a little bit misunderstood these days, mainly because Embarcadero doesn't do a great job of distinguishing what database does now and what it used to do in the past. If we look at the early years of DataSnap, or as it was called Midas, it was all about a dataset provider giving you data as an in-memory representation of the data from your database, and that in-memory representation was in the form of a client dataset. You would modify that client dataset and its in-memory data, and then you would send the changes back to the application server. Those changes were known as a delta, and the application server would resolve those changes back to the original database for you. This is why it's known as a multi-tier system. Rather than the traditional 2 tiers of a client-server system, there were at least 3 tiers involved, and the only thing directly touching the database was the middle tier, or application server. Now, the original DataSnap, or Midas, also included remoting features, that is, calling remote methods from the application server. But it was never really the focus of the old DataSnap, or Midas, and it wasn't really pushed strongly by Ball or CodeGear. Its main functionality was the T dataset provider and the T client dataset, and working on those datasets directly. Then around the time of Delphi 2009, DataSnap was rebuilt so that it no longer relied on DCOM and instead used Indy for TCP and HTTP transport. At this time as well, the remoting parts of DataSnap started to receive more attention. So what DataSnap consists of today is an Indy-based remoting library on top of which the functionality for resolving datasets via client dataset and dataset provider is built on top of that remoting functionality. So there are 2 distinct things there. I call this is just my term, I call the traditional functionality of providing and resolving data via client datasets and dataset providers as DataSnap Classic. Now, I don't know anyone else who does that, that's just my term. On the other hand, however, the new remoting layer on which DataSnap Classic is actually now built, I call those features DataSnap Remoting. And really, DataSnap Remoting has very little to do with actual data, aside from the parameters of the methods you call. It's really all about methods, and you calling methods that are on an application server from your remote clients. These days, when Embarcadero is talking about DataSnap, they're invariably talking about the DataSnap remoting side of things. So the new DataSnap remoting features really don't have that much to do with data. So we have DataSnap Classic, again that's my term, which is the client dataset and T dataset provider. And then we have DataSnap Remoting, which is about calling methods on application servers. And I'm really not going to cover DataSnap Remoting today because it's not so much about data. FireDAC is the latest addition to the available database libraries. It was formerly a third-party product called AnyDAC. That's actually one of its strengths, that it was a third-party product for so long. It was up to AnyDAC version 6, I believe, before it was brought in-house. And like most third-party products, it's taken what Embarcadero, or Ball at the time, provided and built on top of that, filled in a lot of the gaps, made some nicer interfaces, and generally just produced a more rounded product than what came in the box with Delphi. And now that it's come in-house, we've all got the benefits of it. It basically consists of some dataset components and they're named TFD query, TFD table, TFD dataset, etc. So for each of these technologies, we're going to consider the following factors in helping us make a decision between them. Technology lifecycle refers to where in its own lifecycle the particular technology is. Is it a bleeding edge technology, or is it about to fade into obsolescence? Basic connectivity, what databases can you connect to and perform basic SQL operations? What access do you get to advanced server-side features, features that may be particular to a particular database server? And client-side programming, what's the interface like for client-side programming work? First up is the BDE, and in terms of its life cycle, it's on a respirator. It's been deprecated for a decade and a half now. In XE6, it installed but there were no icons. In XE7, it's not even part of the installer. You have to go and get it as a separate download. If you're still using the BDE, you need to get off it as soon as possible. Why? Basically because while it may be working fine for you today, it could break and then no one's going to be interested in fixing it. What's going to break it? Well, it could be a new Windows version, maybe even just a patch from Microsoft. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a future Delphi version, it's not provided at all and there's no way of installing it. dbGo, the ADO components that are supplied with Delphi Professional, well, that's a good component set, but there's some things to be careful about in terms of its life cycle, things you might not be aware of. Okay, so before we move on, let's talk about a few definitions amongst the alphabet soup of Microsoft data libraries, because that can be a bit confusing sometimes. So firstly, we're going to talk about Odbc. Odbc is a cross-platform, cross-database standard for accessing databases. Now, it was strongly promoted by Microsoft in the 90s, but since then they've been saying you should not use Odbc, but instead should be using OLADB. OLADB is Microsoft's proprietary standard for accessing any database, not just Microsoft databases. Now, ADO is a wrapper around OLADB, designed to make accessing the database easier for application programmers, specifically VB6 programmers. ADO.NET is a version of ADO for .NET programmers, but it's got very little compatibility with ADO, and the two are basically separate libraries. Now, ADO itself has had very little updates in recent years. ADO version 2.8 was released with Windows XP and Windows Server 2003. ADO version 6 was included with Vista and subsequent operating systems, but it was actually exactly the same as ADO version 2.8. They just bumped the version number up. So what is Microsoft saying these days? Well, they're actually back to saying that Odbc is the way to go. That's the standard they were promoting in the 90s. What about OLADB then? Well, even with Microsoft SQL Server, SQL Server 2012 is going to be the last to support OLADB. From SQL Server 2014 onwards, Odbc is the primary way they're providing access to the data. Now, what Microsoft is saying that they're just not providing an OLADB provider for SQL Server, and that OLADB as a standard is still alive and well. And remember, that's what ADO is a wrapper of. ADO is a wrapper of OLADB. But given that OLADB is a Microsoft proprietary standard, and they're not going to be developing it for use with their own database product, how enthusiastic are they going to be about continuing development of it in the future? Microsoft has also removed the ADO Remote Data Server feature in Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012. And then for a large part of the year 2011, if you compiled an ADO program on a Windows 7 Service Pack 1 machine and then tried to run it on an earlier operating system, your program would crash. This was because they broke binary compatibility as part of their move to 64-bit, and they really weren't interested in fixing it for quite some time. Here's a few quotes from a Microsoft blog entry about that. It's got a humorous title, "Yes, we made a mistake and are finally going to fix it." Here you can see they're saying, if you're still using ADI for some of your code, that emphasis is mine, not theirs. And then a bit further on, we drastically underestimated the number of customers compiling ADO on Windows 7. So you could read that in two ways, I guess. One is that they now understand how important ADO is to their customers, or you could read it as they're really not interested in supporting ADO going forward. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to know which way Microsoft does regard ADO. So with dbGo, you can still connect to SQL Server 2014. It's just that you can't do it with the OLADB provider directly. You have to go OLADB to Odbc to SQL Server, or you can use the SQL Server native client driver, which is itself a wrapper for both the OLADB and Odbc drivers. So for SQL Server 2014, I assume it only includes Odbc. Confused yet? But with the dbGo ADO components, you can still connect to any other database that has an OLADB provider. With the exception of if you're using the TRDS connection, that won't work on Windows 8 or Windows Server 2012 because the remote data service feature was removed, as I mentioned earlier. So in summary, dbGo, the ADO components of Delphi, they're well supported today, but there's some signs in the future that may not be the case going forward. So if you choose to go with the dbGo components, just be aware of that and keep an eye on any news that's coming with Microsoft, particularly when there's a new Windows version. The dbExpress components, IPX, are likely to be around as long as Interbase is. There's an update of them with each Delphi version. From the point of view of their lifecycle, they're very safe to use. dbExpress was actually officially deprecated in XE5. Now, if the deprecation of dbExpress is anything like the deprecation of the BDE, they'll still be around for quite a long time. But then again, they could also disappear in the next release. That's just the nature of something being deprecated. DataSnap Classic is still fully supported in XE7, and while Embarcadero may be focusing primarily on FireDAC these days, they've also said that they're still fully committed to DataSnap. While we might start to see some closer integration between FireDAC and DataSnap, I don't see the DataSnap Classic features, that is the T-client dataset and T-dataset provider, I don't see them going away. And finally, FireDAC. FireDAC is Embarcadero's officially recommended database solution, so it's well and truly a safe choice in terms of its lifecycle. The other nice thing about its lifecycle is that it's not a version 1 product. It's actually a version, well, it's probably about in XE7 maybe version 7 or 8 product. It's a very mature, well-supported solution, and it's a very safe bet going into the future. So the next factor you have to consider is obviously, will your choice of database access layer connect to your choice of database? Now, the BDE gave you native access to Paradox and DBase, and excellent native access to the SQL database servers of yesteryear, but it's not so great for accessing today's databases. Although you can of course use Odbc for accessing the modern databases. dbGo gives you excellent connectivity to just about everything, because just about everyone jumped a hill when Microsoft said we want you to write an OLADB driver for your database. dbGo supporting ADO, which in itself is a wrapper of OLADB, means that you can use these components to access just about any database out there. dbExpress, as you might expect, connects only to Interbase and to Firebird. dbExpress allows you to connect to quite a wide range of databases, and there's also third-party dbExpress drivers available. I've used the ones from DevArt, they used to be called Core Labs. I've found the third-party drivers to be, in general, better quality than the Embarcadero dbExpress drivers, and they tend to expose some more features of the server as well. I believe there are other third-party dbExpress drivers as well. I just haven't used them myself. Now, DataSnap Classic connects to no databases at all. Instead, Database Classic relies on a companion database access technology. And that companion database access technology could be any one of the other database access layers we've described here today. But without that companion technology, it's only half the puzzle. You need one of those other technologies to do the actual database access, while DataSnap handles the data access at the client-side end. FireDAC has a very impressive list of databases that it gives you access to, and it also has Odbc access, and with that you can access just about anything. FireDAC can also be used in conjunction with DataSnap servers or dbExpress components. The next factor you might want to consider is access to the advanced server-side features that your particular database server provides. The BDE gave you very limited access to these sorts of features. dbGo uses a system of dynamic properties through which you can send and interrogate specific features of your database server. On each of the ADO components, you'll find a properties property, and that's a collection which you can interrogate and set server-specific values. dbExpress, as you expect from a library that's written exclusively to access a single database, has excellent support for Interbase's advanced features, including Interbase's advanced transaction features, server events, and full access to the administration features of the Interbase database server. dbExpress, when you're using the Embarcadero drivers, you have extremely limited access to server-based features, really none at all. With the third-party drivers, there's a few that give you some limited access to some of those features, but still not a lot. DataSnap Classic, well, primarily because DataSnap Classic doesn't even access the database itself, it relies on something else to do that. Because of that, Database Classic in and of itself doesn't give you any access to your database's server-side features. The companion technology you use it with, on the other hand, may give you access to those features. FireDAC has very good access to your database's native server-side features. The exact capabilities can vary depending on which database you choose, but you'll find that many database-specific options can be set as part of the connection component. Here's a list of server-side features that are supported across more than one of the databases that FireDAC supports. And here's a list of features that are supported only by a single database server. I'm not sure if either of these are exhaustive lists. There's probably more features for both that I didn't find. And lastly, here's the features of SQLite that FireDAC can make use of. Now, strictly speaking, they're not server-side features since SQLite isn't a server-based database, but it can access these advanced features of SQLite, and you can see here that it is a very complete SQLite client. Let's now look at client-side programming with these libraries. With dbGo, you can retrieve details of the schema. You can specify whether the cursor should be a client-side snapshot of all the data, or whether it should be a server-based cursor where you only retrieve the data you need at a particular time. With those server-based cursors, you can select a cursor of a particular nature, which lets you do trade-offs between performance and flexibility. The dbGo components let you create client-side indexes on the fly. Just set index field names to any value, and an on-the-fly index will be built. Now, the index field names property isn't unique to the dbGo components, but what is unique is that you can specify a descending index on the index field names property. That's something you can't do with most of the other components. The dbGo components support dataset cloning, whereby you can get a second pointer into the dataset, and so you can move that second pointer around to different records without changing the position of the original cursor into the dataset. dbGo has good support for updating result sets built from multiple tables. If you have a query that joins two tables, in resolving those changes you make to that dataset, dbGo will actually generate two SQL statements, one for the first table and one for the other. dbGo has support for cached updates, although it calls them batched updates. You have to be using a client-side cursor, which ensures that you have a local copy of the data for the caching of those updates to occur. Unlike DataSnap though, you cannot edit the records during the commit process if there's an error. Instead, once the commit is over, you have the opportunity to revise the records that failed to update, and then edit them ready for a subsequent apply updates operation. You also have support for the briefcase model. That's where your datasets are completely disconnected from the server. It's very easy to have disconnected datasets in ADO. If your datasets fulfill the requirements, all you do is set the connection to nil, and then when you want to reconnect, just reset the connection of the dataset. The other important thing about dbGo briefcase model support is that you've got to be able to persist the dataset to disk when the user needs to close the application. The dbGo datasets have a save to file and load from file method for this reason. When you use dbGo, you get transparent connection pooling for free basically. That's courtesy of the OLE DB providers for each database. And lastly, being based on Microsoft standards, the dbGo components are only available for Windows. Client-side programming for dbExpress is very much what you're used to. There's options for schema retrieval. You can monitor the SQL that's going in and out of your application. It's important to keep in mind that any updatable cursor you have is a client-side snapshot of the data, rather than reflecting the data directly on the server. And through the specific TIB transaction component, you've got granular control of the transactions. The transactions can be independent of the connections using the more advanced transaction features. dbExpress has support for cached updates, and it's only supported on Windows. Client-side programming with dbExpress is actually very different from any other database access library. While it still uses a T-dataset model, the lack of some very fundamental features means that you can't use those T-datasets in the way you're used to. All dbExpress datasets are unidirectional server-side cursors. They're read-only, you can't edit, delete, insert, and you can't filter on them, you can't search for things, and you can't even go back. You can only go forwards. dbExpress is supported on all the different platforms Delphi can deploy to, and while it's supported across all those platforms, with those lack of features you might be wondering, well, why would I actually use it? The truth is you don't use it on its own. Not for most conventional programs anyway. dbExpress was really designed as a backend for DataSnap Classic, which needs something like dbExpress to do the actual database access. So far we've only looked at the client-server database solutions. DataSnap Classic is the first one that can support 3-tier or N-tier deployment. That's a system where you don't just have a rich client and then a database server. Instead you have a thin client, an application server, and then your database server. You configure things that way for improved scalability and the centralization of business logic in your application server. Database Classic can actually work in both those models, client-server or N-tier. DataSnap Classic works with the T-client dataset, which is a memory table of the data from your application server. Specifically, you could say it's a disconnected client-side cursor. When you make changes to the data in the client dataset, you're only changing it in memory. Then later, when you apply updates, the changes get applied to the actual database. Because of this, it's very easy to write briefcase model applications using DataSnap Classic. Once you call tclientDataset.applyUpdates in your client, the Delta packet is sent to the application server where the tDataset provider resolves those changes and applies them to the database. But before those changes are applied, there's good support in DataSnap Classic for modifying those changes before they're actually applied to the database. You might need to do this because of some business logic rules that are stored in your application server, but not in your remote client. The client dataset has excellent support for cloning the cursor. That is, just like the dbGo feature, you can clone your dataset and you receive a second pointer into the records, a second cursor, which you can move around without it changing the original cursor pointer into the record set. So you clone your dataset and it can be viewed in, you can be viewing one record in one grid and then another record in another grid, both of them connecting back to the same dataset. You change the data in one grid and you'll automatically see the change in the other grid. The tclient dataset filter property supports more operators than the standard dataset filter. This is very useful because there's no SQL on a client-side DataSnap Classic application, so this enhanced filtering comes in very handy to make up for that shortcoming. You also have internal calc fields, which are calculated fields that you normally have with a T dataset, but unlike those regular calculated fields, internal calc fields don't recalculate their values every single time you go to a record. Instead, internal calc fields store the results of the calculation. Because that result is stored, it means that the field can be used in filters and indexes, which isn't the case for standard calculated fields. Aggregate fields are fields that perform arithmetic operations on all the records of a dataset. For instance, you could use an arithmetic field to do an average of all the values of a particular field in the dataset, or a sum. Then if you apply a filter or a range to that dataset, the aggregate field value automatically recalculates based on the limited scope of the filter or the range. DataSnap Classic is supported on all platforms: Windows, OS X, iOS, and Android. FireDAC client-side programming is interesting because it comes from the perspective of a product that was written to be a BDE replacement, but then as DataSnap was released and enhanced, many of the features from DataSnap were added to the AnyDAC product, as it was then known. So what we have now is a library with the ease of use of the BDE, but with a lot of the features of DataSnap Classic. Now firstly, FireDAC has excellent cross-database support. It's not always transparent. You might have to do a task a slightly different way to accommodate multiple databases, but the solution is much more elegant than putting ifdefs everywhere through your code. You can get the metadata of your database. You can map data types. Say one database has a Boolean type and the other database doesn't. You can map your fields to take account for that. Differences in SQL dialects, you can actually have conditional statements within your SQL that allow you to provide native SQL to each of those databases, but within the one statement. It can handle auto-increment fields of different types from different databases. There's paging of record sets, either using the native record set paging of MS SQL Server, or it can simulate that behavior for other databases. As you'd expect, that simulated behavior isn't quite as performant as the native paging built into MS SQL Server. There are asynchronous operations. You can cancel long-running operations. You can fetch data asynchronously. There's also connection pooling and connection recovery. And all of that is cross-platform and cross-database. All FireDAC datasets have a fetch options property, and you can see here some of the values that can be set for it. You can see that this property gives you a lot of flexibility in the different type of dataset that you retrieve from the server. And there's some particularly nice stuff in there as well. For instance, the record skip property. And when you first read about this, you might think, what would that be useful for? Skipping the first n records. But once you read on and see that when you use it in conjunction with the row set size, that it's actually a very good solution for doing paging for web applications. So FireDAC is a library where a lot of the use cases have been well flushed out. Now, using table style components isn't always a good idea, but if you do like to use them, you can use the TFD table component in either standard mode, where the table acts more like a query really, pulling down a bunch of records and then operating them in the local snapshot of those records. Or you can use it in the live data window mode, where it keeps only a small number of records in memory at any time. In effect, that gives you the same sort of behavior that you used to with a T table and scrolling through a very large paradox table with a DB grid. But instead, you're doing the same thing and scrolling through against a server-side database. Still, is it a good idea? Maybe, maybe not, but it's an interesting feature. Options inheritance is a very useful feature that when you change a property on a connection, all the datasets that use that connection automatically receive the change unless you've modified the property on that dataset. So it helps you at design time to keep all your datasets accessing the database in the way you want them to, rather than having accidental component changes or not changing all the properties of all your components. FireDAC supports cached updates, either in a centralized manner, where it applies the updates in the order they were made, regardless of what table it was, or in a decentralized way, where it applies all the updates onto a single table, one at a time, one table at a time. There's a disconnected mode for briefcase applications. There's also a memory table component, tfdmemTable. Now, unlike DataSnap Classic, in which all your data comes in memory tables, with FireDAC, if your data is coming from a database, there's not much advantage to actually putting it in a memory table, as opposed to having a regular FireDAC table or query. In DataSnap Classic, there is an advantage to having it in a memory table, but in FireDAC, the standard datasets, the standard TFD table and TFD query, basically support all of the features of the TFD table. So you really only use the FireDAC memory table if it's something that didn't come from a database. Say you imported a CSV file or something like that. Like DataSnap Classic, FireDAC supports internal Calc fields and also aggregate fields. And a very interesting feature of FireDAC is local SQL. That's where it makes use of an embedded SQLite engine to perform client-side queries on either FireDAC datasets or any other dataset. So basically you can perform SQL without having access to an SQL engine. There's SQL monitoring of the SQL your application is generating, and FireDAC supports all the supported Delphi platforms, Windows, OS X, iOS, and Android. So now we've reached the recommendations stage. So this will be my personal recommendation, and feel free to disagree. I'm sure there'll be many people who do. And of course it relies on your specific circumstances. These are more just sort of general recommendations. Now, these recommendations are qualified by both whether you're targeting only Windows or you're targeting cross-platform, and also whether you're writing single-user, client-server, or multi-tier applications. If you're writing a single-user application for Windows, then in my opinion you can't go past FireDAC as your data access layer. Its advanced client-side features make it ideal for single-user applications. After FireDAC, I'd look at IBX if you're using an Interbase or Firebird database, or perhaps dbGo if you don't really want to branch out to something new with FireDAC. I've listed DataSnap in its various permutations here because you can actually write a single-user application that uses DataSnap, but personally I wouldn't do it. I would choose one of the other options first. DataSnap is just a bit too complicated for a single-user application. If you're writing a client-server application and you own Delphi Professional, then my number one recommendation for you would be to go out and buy the FireDAC add-on pack and write a client-server FireDAC application. Alternatively, also a number one recommendation if you're using Interbase or Firebird, use IBX. That's an excellent option. The FireDAC add-on pack is of course extra money and not necessarily cheap, so my next recommendation would be for client-server would be dbGo. You then could write a DataSnap application, client-server DataSnap application that used dbGo for the back end, but unless you had serious intentions of porting it to a multi-tier application, I wouldn't bother myself. It's just a level of complexity you don't need if you're sticking to client-server. My recommendations for client-server applications with Delphi Enterprise are very similar to those with Delphi Pro. Starting with FireDAC, you get that in the box with Enterprise, so there's no add-on pack to buy, or IBX if you're using Interbase. Then dbGo, and lastly different permutations of DataSnap, but again DataSnap's a bit too complicated for a client-server database unless you're sure you're going to go to multi-tier. When it comes to multi-tier applications, this is an area where I expect there may be some significant change over the next few versions of RAD Studio. For the thin client and its communication with the app server, at this point in time, I would recommend to use DataSnap for that. It is possible to also use FireDAC with DataSnap, but at this point in time, the process doesn't seem all that well documented, and I'm not certain it gives you much more than DataSnap does at the moment. For the app server talking to the database server, if you're using SQL Server, I'd say go straight for dbGo. My next choice would be dbExpress. Now, dbExpress has been deprecated, but I don't expect it to go away anytime soon. I think it's going to be a bit like the BDE and be around for a long time. And I'm actually recommending that over FireDAC for these app server recommendations, primarily because FireDAC was written more for client-server access and hasn't yet been fully optimized for the lightweight database access style that is really best suited to an DataSnap app server. For Interbase, the number one recommendation is IBX, followed by dbExpress and FireDAC. And for all other databases, I'm just recommending firstly dbExpress, then FireDAC. Just a final note about dbExpress. I'm recommending it with the anticipation that at some point in the next few years, you would probably have to rewrite that dbExpress code and convert it to FireDAC. Now, it's in a back end of an app server, and it's not particularly sophisticated code. It's mainly just components placed down with setting the params and the SQL properties. So conversion of that dbExpress code to FireDAC, I anticipate will be trivial for most projects. The ease at which that code could be migrated in the future from dbExpress to FireDAC is one of the reasons why I'm recommending a deprecated product, which I normally wouldn't do. In subsequent versions of RAD Studio, I expect these recommendations will probably change. I expect that the thin client to the app server layer, the FireDAC and DataSnap combination is probably going to come to the fore. I expect it to be improved substantially. And at that time, DataSnap on its own will probably be my second choice. And my prediction for a future app server to database preferred communication layer will be FireDAC, followed by dbExpress, pretty much the reverse of what I'm recommending now. For cross-platform applications, single user, FireDAC again comes number one. Its client-side features are very appealing for writing single user applications. IBX comes as close second if you're using Interbase. DataSnap dbGo is a mistake. That shouldn't be there because dbGo is obviously not cross-platform. And any sort of DataSnap combination for a single user application, as I said, for the Windows version is overkill in my opinion. Cross-platform client-server applications with Delphi Pro. As with Windows, I recommend you buy the FireDAC add-on pack. There is no dbGo for a cross-platform application for a number two choice, but there is IBX. And DataSnap with FireDAC, you need the FireDAC add-on pack is my number three choice because DataSnap is complicated, overcomplicated for a client-server application. Using Delphi Enterprise for cross-platform client-server applications, the recommendations are pretty much the same as the Delphi Professional ones, except that you can also have a DataSnap dbExpress client-server application, and I'm putting that slightly above a DataSnap FireDAC application, mainly because the FireDAC data access layer isn't as lightweight as dbExpress, and DataSnap really needs a lightweight database engine behind it. For cross-platform multi-tier applications, for the thin client to the app server layer, I'm recommending DataSnap. It's pretty much the only choice at this point in time. For a cross-platform app server, if it's Interbase, I'm recommending IBX for the back end, but then I'm recommending FireDAC over dbExpress, which is the reverse of what I recommended on Windows. The main reason for that is that on the other platforms, FireDAC is going to get more attention going forward. It may not be as performant as dbExpress in a back end, but I anticipate you'll have less problems in a cross-platform environment using FireDAC as time goes on, as compared to dbExpress. And when it comes to future cross-platform multi-tier applications, I anticipate that we'll see the same situation as the Windows version, the same configuration being the preferred solution, that being a combination of FireDAC and DataSnap in the remote client, and the app server a FireDAC solution.
All right. So one of the questions in here is, what were you using for your presentation there?
I'm using MindJet Mind Manager. I don't actually own a copy of PowerPoint, so I use that one for all my presentations.
I thought it worked pretty good for a way to organize things.
Yes, yeah, and in the presentations it's quite good because things don't disappear off screen straight away, which I quite like.
Yeah. Here's a question: is there support for nested tables in FireDAC?
Okay, so yeah, it depends. Nested tables could refer to quite a few things, I guess. One thing that I know there definitely is support for is Oracle nested cursors. I mentioned that in the presentation. Jim, you might know this. I was trying to get when that question came up, I was trying to get a definite answer to this one, but T-dataset field, is that supported by FireDAC? I haven't actually tried to use it myself.
Oh, I haven't tried to use it either. I suspect it is, but I have not tried specifically with that one. So
yeah. So this is sort of what I was alluding to it towards the end there. I don't have any inside information on this, but I expect that there's some integration between FireDAC and DataSnap today, and I expect that's just only going to increase in the future. If the nested tables aren't there now, similar to the client datasets nested tables, I'd be very surprised if they're not added in the future.
Yeah, I know that Marcos Cantu said specifically that FireDAC is definitely where we're putting our emphasis in database features going forward. So
yes, yeah.
Things that aren't there today will be there soon. Although not the focus of, moving along, presentation and remoting, i.e. remote procedure calls into a server or client, is a critical aspect of distinguishing extensible data access controls, particularly for RESTful applications. Why does FireDAC not have such good support for that requirement? Do you have any insights into using FireDAC for that purposes? So FireDAC is a database access, not a remoting framework.
That's my opinion as well, Jim. It's DataSnap, as I think of it, has two sides. These aren't the official names, but the DataSnap Classic and the DataSnap Remoting sides of it. And yeah, they're the two ones built on top of the other, but the two don't really have a lot to do with each other. So if you've got a copy of Delphi Enterprise, then you've got DataSnap and the DataSnap remoting features, and that's what you would, if you wanted out of the box remoting, that's the feature you would use. And yeah, I don't think the DataSnap remoting stuff is going to go away anytime soon. So does it need to be added into FireDAC when you've got it there in DataSnap? I'd say probably not.
It's easy to hide components such as ADO dbExpress in the IDE. Oh, so you don't want them visible in the IDE anymore?
Yeah, well, that's just a basic IDE operation. What is it? The installed packages menu option?
Yep, that sounds right. Just installed packages and just find that package and remove the checkbox. So here's a good question. It says, if the libraries were easily swappable, which they are not, why not just go with FireDAC now and avoid having to convert later in the future? Okay,
so definitely in my recommendations section, as you saw, I qualified in a lot of different scenarios, different styles of application and which version of Delphi you owned and so on. And in some of those, I recommended FireDAC as, yes, that's my number one choice. Others, I said it was further down the list, usually the number two. And that was basically just when it wasn't the top choice, that was more because either you didn't have that functionality in your Delphi Professional versus Delphi Enterprise, or it was because in the case of the in an application server, the FireDAC library was built more optimized for an end user client application. And there were some things in there which some of them have been addressed, but mean that it wasn't as lightweight as you would like for an application server. You might get better performance using the dbExpress, very lightweight, or you might get better performance with a dbGo in the back end using just a server-side cursor. I'm sure that's going to change in the future, which is why I added that section about in the future I expect that those things are going to change. But The libraries, are they easily swappable? To some degree they are, and some degree they're not. Like, definitely swapping out those components, if you do it manually, is quite a chore if you've got lots and lots of query components. But there's now a tool out there which can help you with that sort of thing. That's the refind utility that comes, it's a command line program. And I'll be talking about that in my later session on Thursday with the BDE to FireDAC migration. And yeah, I'll be showing you how you can use the refind utility in that for migrating BDE to FireDAC, or migrating pretty much any library to FireDAC, or any one component to any other component within reason.
So you can use refind to move between different frameworks besides BDE?
Yes, you can. Yeah, you definitely can. It's not really, although they give you a script for the BDE to make it easy, there's nothing stopping you from writing your own script, which is quite easy to do, which will let you migrate from any component to any other component. And it gets rid of a lot of the manual labor associated with swapping components out. Doesn't do an absolute complete job, but it speeds up the process significantly.
Oh, that's good. So Tim's actually elaborating on his earlier question. He says, what is the recommended way to reach a DataSnap server method from a client program when using FireDAC? So you're using FireDAC in the client. How do you reach the server method specifically to return objects such as streams?
Okay, so you're using FireDAC in the client, and you have a DataSnap server. Well, I assume you're going to have to make DataSnap calls from the client as well. I'm not aware that there's a way presently with FireDAC to call a server-side DataSnap method using FireDAC. So your program would have to, your client program is going to have to incorporate both DataSnap and FireDAC features. And returning objects such as streams, yes, you can return those sorts of arguments from the DataSnap server methods.
So FireDAC's really around the idea of working for data sets. And so if it's not a data set you want back, then you probably want to use a different methodology for that, it sounds like.
Yes, yeah, that's my understanding of the situation.
So it says, if you're talking about DataSnap, do you mean DataSnap or REST DataSnap or both?
Well, most of what I was talking about in the presentation was talking about what I call DataSnap Classic. Where you mentioned DataSnap REST, you're probably more thinking about the remoting features of DataSnap. But REST is really just a transport layer anyway. So the DataSnap Classic transporting data sets across the wire, would be built on top of that REST support anyway. But if you're talking about calling REST methods, then that's the DataSnap remoting features, and I didn't really talk about those during my presentation.
So Walter's asking what the commitment of Embarcadero is with DataSnap technology. And so this actually came up earlier during JT's session on EMS, and he said that we are fully committed behind DataSnap going forward to keep moving forward with it as a technology. So we are committed to DataSnap. It's going to keep going. It's not going away anytime soon. So here's a further elaboration on that, I guess. He's saying that SQL connection components enable us to generate DataSnap client classes with a single mouse click. The FD connection doesn't offer that option. So if we're going to use a server method, we either have to drop an FD stored proc onto the form or create and configure one programmatically. When we're using FireDAC, is this how we are intended to substitute for the handy dbExpress generated client classes?
I'm sorry, Tim, but you've sort of gone beyond my level of expertise on this particular part of FireDAC. Yeah, so I'm certain if Kerry Jensen was here, he would be able to give us a definite answer on that one. If you haven't seen it already, I'd probably recommend Kerry's 2-hour webinar and white paper on FireDAC. He covers a lot of stuff inside that. I can't remember if he covers this one exactly, but yeah, Jim, you might have a few more details on that one, do you?
Let me grab that white paper real quick and post that. In mobile client application, is it better to use DataSnap or REST DataSnap for getting data into a data set from, for example, FireDAC?
Getting data in a data set from example FireDAC. Okay, not sure where I guess he's got FireDAC in the mobile client. Yeah, I'm not too sure. I don't quite follow the question quite well enough what he's asking there. I'll see if I can get a link on the... Yeah, sorry, I might just have to pass that one. Sorry, Jim, I don't really think I've got a good answer for it.
That's fine. That happens sometimes. You get a lot of these good questions in here, and they get pretty involved. All right, let's see if I can find this DataSnap webinar here. Because, yeah, that's right, I'd forgotten. He put together a really good DataSnap.
Yeah, Kerry Jensen, no app Island, I think it's called.
That's it, right there. I found it. Oh, so Tim says he's read and watched all of Kerry's content, and he doesn't have the answer yet. So I would suggest emailing Kerry or Marco probably would be your best bet, and see if they can direct you further. It sounds like a pretty advanced question.
Although if he's done all that research, I mean, he's looking for a shortcut to generate code for him.
Yeah.
If he's done all that research and tried, perhaps it just isn't there yet.
That could be. That could be exactly. Sometimes you just have to write the code.
Yes.
Although, if you're like me, I write code to write my code for me. It seems Microsoft has invested heavily in the link world. Where is Embarcadero's focus in this regard? Is there any data access components supporting link?
Certainly out of the box, there's nothing supporting link. You do get some of the third-party object relational mapper libraries that support some link-like state syntax.
Yep.
But it's not calling the Microsoft link libraries. It's just a replica of the link syntax.
So yeah, TMS has their ORM library that has link support.
Aurelius, that's it. Yeah.
Yep. And earlier, Marco, there was a question about us Embarcadero investing in some ORM solutions. And Marco said that we've done a survey of our users and found that the number, not that there wasn't anybody interested in ORM, but the number of users interested in ORM versus other features that we were considering, we decided to go with some of the other features that we were considering because there was more interest in those. So not to say that we're not going to do an ORM solution, but that's not the top of the priority list at this moment. What's better for performance, stability, and security, DataSnap or REST DataSnap?
Well, it's not really one or the other, really, because DataSnap is built on REST these days. DataSnap is REST, all REST. So, yeah, you could compare the DataSnap classic features of remoting data sets versus the calling methods, but they're two very different approaches. If you're probably, I think a better way of expressing it is maybe if you were talking about FireDAC versus DataSnap. If you're writing a mobile application, should you use FireDAC or DataSnap? And the big question on that would depend on whether or not your mobile application is going to be able to get remote access to the server, the database server directly. If it is, then FireDAC would be a good choice. If it can't, if you need to go through an application server called remote methods and do disconnected data access, then DataSnap that's very good at that, although you get a lot of those features are in FireDAC as well. So yeah, there's not clear answers to every situation. There's always trade-offs.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this one, I think you need to know a bit more about the applications themselves to know for certain. Certainly in terms of stability and performance, both DataSnap and FireDAC are mature products. There was some question about data quality performance with DataSnap remote methods a few versions ago, but there was work done. I remember Marco saying in XE6 there was work done to improve that performance. And yeah, FireDAC is a very fast library. It can sometimes, because it works with any database and can research with almost any data structure and so on, it often does a lot of queries of the metadata. And sometimes it queries those a little bit more often than it needs to, but they're only very quick queries, and so it's not a significant drain on the performance of your application.
Yeah, I find lots of times there isn't always, like you said, always a clear answer, and it's a matter of just learning some of the options and then looking at your particular use case and doing some testing to find out what works best. Anyway, it's about almost top of the hour. I've got 5 minutes to go. So thank you, Lachlan, for this great session. Very informative, and for answering all these questions.
You're welcome, Jim. Nice to speak to you again.
Yeah, likewise. Good to hear from you.